Can faith and reason walk hand in hand? For centuries, people have wrestled with this question, seeing faith as blind trust and reason as cold logic. But what if the two were never meant to be in conflict? What if true wisdom lies not in choosing one over the other, but in embracing both as paths to the same divine truth? No one embodied this idea more than Thomas Aquinas, a man who dared to bridge the gap between belief and intellect. Born into nobility, imprisoned by his own family and mocked as a student, he rose above every challenge to become one of the most brilliant theological minds in history. His masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, did not weaken faith with reason. It strengthened it. Through his writings, he proved that to seek God is not to abandon the mind, but to elevate it. His life, however, was more than an academic pursuit. It was a spiritual journey marked by humility, devotion, and an encounter so profound that it left him in awestruck silence. As we walk through his story, we will uncover not just the intellect of Aquinas, but the unyielding faith that guided him, because even now his voice still calls to all who seek truth, not just in books, but in the very fabric of existence. Imagine a child born into nobility, surrounded by wealth, status, and expectations. Thomas Aquinas came into the world in 1225, a son of the prestigious Aquino family. His future seemed predetermined, perhaps a knight, a statesman, or even a high-ranking church official. But God had a different plan. Even as a boy, Thomas was different. He was quiet yet deeply thoughtful, with a hunger for knowledge that set him apart. From an early age, Thomas showed an unusual fascination with God's mysteries. While other children played, he asked profound questions about existence, creation, and the divine. "What is God?" he once asked his teachers, a simple yet earth-shaking question that would define his entire life's pursuit. It was as if something inside him already knew he was destined for more than what his noble lineage dictated. At just 5 years old, Thomas was sent to the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, a place of silence, prayer, and wisdom. Here, he immersed himself in scripture and philosophy, absorbing teachings far beyond his years. Unlike other students who memorized texts for duty, Thomas devoured them out of sheer passion. His mind was a sponge, and every word of God felt like a key, unlocking the mysteries of the universe. But his family had different plans. They saw his education as a stepping stone to a powerful position in the church, perhaps even the abbot of Monte Cassino, a role of influence and prestige. They never imagined that Thomas had no interest in power or titles. His heart longed for something deeper, something that no earthly position could satisfy. As he grew, whispers of his brilliance spread. Teachers marveled at his intellect, yet he remained humble, never seeking admiration. Instead, he was drawn toward a radical idea, joining the newly formed Dominican order, a group of wandering preachers dedicated to a life of poverty and study. To his noble family, this was unthinkable. Why would a son of Aquino choose a life of begging and teaching when he could command authority and wealth? Thomas, however, knew his calling was beyond human ambition. He wasn't driven by status, but by truth. And so, with quiet resolve, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would leave behind the comforts of nobility and follow God's will, no matter the cost. But destiny is rarely without trials. His decision would spark outrage, betrayal, and a test of faith that would shape him into the man history remembers. Before he could embrace his calling, he would first have to face those who loved him the most, yet understood him the least. When Thomas Aquinas announced his desire to join the Dominican order, his family was outraged. To them, this was not just an unconventional choice, it was a betrayal of everything they had planned for him. The Aquino family had noble blood, wealth, and influence. They had envisioned Thomas as a high-ranking church official, perhaps even an abbot or a bishop, wielding both spiritual and political power. But a Dominican? A poor, wandering preacher? That was disgraceful. His mother, Theodora, was especially horrified. She had hoped to see her son rise in status, not lower himself to a life of simplicity and humility. The Dominicans were different from the traditional clergy. Rather than staying in grand monasteries, they lived among the people, teaching and preaching. To noble families, they were seen almost as beggars. This was not the future she wanted for her son. Desperate to change his mind, his family tried reasoning with him, appealing to his sense of duty and loyalty. "Think of your name," they pleaded. "Think of what you could become." But Thomas had already made up his mind. He was not seeking greatness in the eyes of men. He was seeking truth in the eyes of God. No wealth, no title, no comfort could sway him from that path. Realizing that words would not move him, his family took drastic action. As Thomas prepared to leave for Paris to begin his studies, his brothers, both military men, ambushed him. They seized him and, under orders from their mother, locked him away in the family's castle. If they couldn't persuade him, they would imprison him until he came to his senses. For months, Thomas remained confined, cut off from the outside world. They hoped isolation would weaken his resolve, that time would make him reconsider. But instead of breaking him, the experience only strengthened his faith. Rather than despair, he spent his days in prayer, reflection, and study. His body was imprisoned, but his mind and soul remained free. His family tried everything. They sent priests to counsel him, attempting to convince him that the Dominican life was beneath his status. They even resorted to a crueler test, sending a woman into his room to tempt him into abandoning his vows. But Thomas, in an act of unwavering devotion, drove her away, grabbing a burning stick from the fireplace and carving a cross into the door as a sign of his unshakable faith. It became clear that nothing would make him renounce his calling. He was willing to lose everything, his inheritance, his comfort, even his family's approval, for the sake of truth. And so, after nearly a year in captivity, his mother finally relented. Under the cover of night, she arranged for his escape, allowing him to climb down from his window and flee to the Dominicans. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. He had chosen the harder road, and the world would not make it easy for him. His journey to unite faith and reason was just beginning, and soon he would face even greater trials, not just from his family, but from the very church he sought to serve. Locked away in the towering walls of the Aquino castle, Thomas Aquinas found himself a prisoner, not of enemies, but of his own family. His mother and brothers had taken drastic measures, believing they were saving him from a terrible mistake. They saw his desire to join the Dominican order as reckless, a waste of his noble heritage. But Thomas saw it differently. To him, this was a test, a moment where he had to choose between earthly expectations and divine purpose. At first, his family thought he would break. They believed that isolation, hunger, and loneliness would wear him down. But Thomas was not like other young men. Rather than despairing, he turned his imprisonment into a time of spiritual growth. He prayed, meditated, and studied whatever texts he could get his hands on. The walls around him could not contain his mind or his faith. As the months dragged on, his family became more desperate. They sent high-ranking priests to argue with him, using theology to persuade him that his path was wrong. But every argument they presented, Thomas countered with wisdom beyond his years. He did not fight with anger or defiance. He responded with truth, spoken gently yet firmly. His words carried the weight of someone who was not merely debating, but who had already found the answer. Then came their most devious test. Believing that temptation would succeed where logic had failed, they sent a woman into his chamber, an attempt to lure him away from his vow of purity. It was a cruel trap, designed to appeal to human weakness. But Thomas did not waver. In a dramatic moment of resolve, he seized a burning log from the fireplace and drove her out, marking the door with a cross. That night, he knelt in prayer, asking God to strengthen him in his commitment. It is said that from that moment on, he was given an extraordinary grace, a deep peace that never left him. His family was left with no choice. They saw that Thomas could not be broken, and their plans had failed. His mother, unwilling to openly concede defeat, secretly allowed his escape. Under the cover of darkness, Thomas climbed down from the castle window and fled to the Dominicans, where he was finally free to pursue his calling. But even as he left the castle behind, the struggle was far from over. The world outside was filled with new challenges, doubts, and opposition. Thomas had won his first great battle, but an even greater one awaited him, the battle to unite faith and reason in a world that often saw them as opposites. What about you? Have you ever faced opposition for following a calling that others didn't understand? If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're inspired by Thomas's unwavering faith, type grace to show that you're following along. When Thomas Aquinas finally joined the Dominican order, many expected him to become a rising star immediately. He had already proven his brilliance, outwitting priests and scholars while still a young man. Surely he would now step forward, make bold arguments, and astonish the world with his wisdom. But Thomas did something unexpected. He remained silent. In the bustling academic world of the University of Paris, where debates and discussions filled the air, Thomas barely spoke. He observed, listened, and absorbed knowledge like a sponge, but he rarely voiced his thoughts. His fellow students, mistaking his quiet nature for dullness, mockingly called him the dumb ox. To them, he was a slow, lumbering figure, big in stature, but seemingly small in intellect. Even his professor, Albert the Great, noticed how others underestimated him. One day, after hearing yet another insult toward Thomas, Albert smiled and made a quiet prophecy. "You call him a dumb ox, but one day his bellowing will be heard throughout the world." While others rushed to prove themselves, Thomas took his time. He understood something few did. Wisdom isn't about speaking the loudest, but about understanding the deepest. His silence was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. He was laying a foundation, building his knowledge patiently, brick by brick, preparing for something far greater than mere classroom debates. Then, one day, that silence was broken. When Thomas finally spoke, his words were like thunder. He didn't argue with arrogance or anger. He spoke with clarity, precision, and undeniable truth. His deep understanding of philosophy and theology stunned everyone. Those who had mocked him were left in awe. The dumb ox had roared, and the world would never be the same. But Thomas wasn't concerned with proving himself to others. His heart was set on something higher, uniting faith and reason, answering the great questions of existence, and bringing light to those who struggled to reconcile the mind with the soul. He knew that knowledge, without humility, was empty. His journey was far from over. In the years ahead, he would face opposition, controversy, and even rejection. But nothing could shake the foundation he had built in those years of quiet preparation. Because sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones that first learn to listen. As Thomas Aquinas delved deeper into his studies, he encountered a thinker who would change everything for him, Aristotle. At the time, Aristotle's works were viewed with suspicion. Many church leaders saw his philosophy as dangerous, a relic of pagan thought that could corrupt Christian doctrine. But Thomas saw something different. He saw truth hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Unlike other theologians who dismissed philosophy as a threat to faith, Thomas believed that reason and revelation were not enemies, but allies. To him, Aristotle's logic and rational thought could actually strengthen the understanding of God, not weaken it. This was revolutionary. The idea that philosophy could serve theology rather than oppose it was something few dared to suggest. Thomas set out on a bold mission to bring Aristotle's wisdom into harmony with Christian doctrine. He studied deeply, connecting Aristotle's ideas about nature, logic, and ethics with biblical truths. What he discovered was profound. Just as faith reveals divine mysteries, reason helps us understand the world God created. Truth, he argued, could never contradict itself because all truth comes from God. But not everyone saw it that way. Many scholars and church leaders viewed his work as dangerous. To them, philosophy was a slippery slope that could lead to heresy. Some even condemned Aristotle's influence, fearing that rational thought could overshadow divine revelation. Thomas faced fierce resistance, with some branding his ideas as reckless and even heretical. Yet, he remained unshaken. He continued writing, debating, and teaching, refusing to abandon his belief that faith and reason belong together. He saw himself not as a rebel, but as a bridge builder, uniting the ancient wisdom of the Greeks with the eternal truth of Christ. His determination was unwavering. If God created both the mind and the soul, then using one should never mean abandoning the other. Slowly, his ideas gained ground. The brilliance of his arguments could not be ignored. Those who once resisted him began to listen. What once seemed like a contradiction, faith and reason, now appeared as two sides of the same divine coin. But his journey was far from over. The battle for truth would intensify, and Thomas would soon find himself at the center of fierce intellectual and theological warfare. He had uncovered a light in the darkness, but could he keep it burning? The world of Thomas Aquinas was not just a place of peaceful monasteries and quiet study halls. It was a battlefield, one where ideas clashed as fiercely as swords on a battlefield. As his reputation grew, so did the opposition. His bold belief that faith and reason could work together was seen as a threat by many in the church. Some called him a visionary, while others called him a danger to tradition. At the heart of the conflict was his use of Aristotle. Many theologians feared that blending Greek philosophy with Christian doctrine would dilute the purity of the faith. They believed that divine revelation alone was enough. What need was there for logic and reason? Thomas, however, argued that God had given humanity both faith and intellect for a reason. To reject reason was to reject a gift from God himself. His ideas did not go unnoticed. Some university faculty and high-ranking church officials openly opposed his teachings. In Paris, a list of 219 philosophical and theological statements was condemned, many of them directly related to Aristotle and, by extension, Thomas's work. It was a direct challenge to everything he stood for. But Thomas did not respond with anger or personal attacks. He answered with clarity, patience, and overwhelming wisdom. Armed with his quill, he wrote tirelessly, crafting detailed responses that would eventually form some of the most important theological texts in history. He defended his work not just with passion, but with logic so precise that even his critics struggled to refute him. Still, the battle was not easy. Some labeled him as dangerous. Others whispered accusations of heresy. To stand against long-standing traditions took immense courage. But Thomas never wavered. He believed that truth could withstand scrutiny, and he welcomed debate, not as a fight, but as a way to sharpen understanding. Then, something remarkable happened. The more people read his works, the more they saw the brilliance of his vision. Slowly, the opposition softened. His methodical, step-by-step reasoning revealed a harmony between philosophy and theology that few had ever seen before. Many who had once opposed him became his followers, but Thomas never sought fame or victory. He wasn't fighting for personal recognition. He was fighting for truth. His quill was his sword, and his words became his legacy. And as the battle of ideas continued, one thing became clear. Thomas Aquinas was no longer just a philosopher. He was a force that would shape the future of Christian thought forever. There are books that inform, books that inspire, and then there are books that change history. Thomas Aquinas was about to write one of the latter. It would become his greatest work, his masterpiece, and the most ambitious attempt ever made to unite faith and reason into a single, unshakable system of thought. He called it the Summa Theologica, and it would be nothing less than a roadmap to understanding God, the universe, and the meaning of existence. The Summa was not just another theological text. It was an intellectual cathedral, a towering structure of knowledge built brick by brick, designed to answer every great question about God, man, morality, and salvation. Thomas didn't just state his beliefs, he anticipated every possible argument against them and then carefully, methodically answered them all. His approach was revolutionary. He followed a format called the scholastic method, where he laid out a question, presented objections, and then responded with clear, logical explanations. He didn't fear opposing ideas. He welcomed them, engaging with them not as threats, but as stepping stones to deeper understanding. This was the mind of Aquinas at its finest, calm, precise, unshaken by controversy. Through the Summa, Thomas bridged the gap between philosophy and theology in a way no one had done before. He showed how Aristotle's logic could be used to defend the Christian faith, proving that belief in God was not just an act of devotion, but also an act of reason. His famous arguments for God's existence, like the 5 ways, would become some of the most studied philosophical proofs in history, but this was not merely an academic exercise. Thomas wrote the Summa for everyone, not just scholars and clergy, but anyone who sought truth. He believed that understanding God should not be reserved for a privileged few. It should be accessible to all who hungered for wisdom. And so, though his work was deep, it was never out of reach. It was a guide, an invitation to explore the mind of God. The impact of the Summa Theologica was immediate and enduring. It became the foundation for Catholic theology, influencing popes, councils, and thinkers for centuries. Even those who disagreed with Thomas could not ignore the depth and brilliance of his work. His arguments shaped Christian philosophy in ways that are still felt today. Yet despite its vast scope, Thomas never finished the Summa. Near the end of his life, something happened, something that made him stop writing altogether. A moment of profound mystery, an encounter with the divine, would leave even the greatest thinker of his age speechless. For all his brilliance, all his logic, and all his philosophical mastery, Thomas Aquinas knew one thing with absolute certainty: God could never be fully grasped by the human mind alone. No argument, no book, no sum of human wisdom could contain the infinite majesty of the divine. And near the end of his life, something happened that shook him to his core, something that even he could not explain. Thomas was no stranger to spiritual experiences. Though he was known for his intellect, his life was filled with moments of deep mysticism. There were times when he would enter such profound states of prayer that those around him could feel something extraordinary in his presence. It was as if his mind and soul were being lifted beyond this world. But then, in 1273, something changed. While celebrating Mass, Thomas had a vision, one so overwhelming, so beyond anything he had ever encountered, that he was left silent. The man who had spent his life writing, debating, and explaining the mysteries of God could now say only this: "All that I have written seems like straw compared to what I have seen." From that moment on, he stopped writing. The Summa Theologica, his life's work, his greatest intellectual achievement, was left unfinished. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because he had seen something that words could never capture. Those around him were stunned. How could a man who had spent his entire life explaining God now fall into silence? Some believed that he had received a glimpse of heaven, something so glorious that human language was inadequate to describe it. Others speculated that he had an encounter with Christ himself, one that left him forever changed. Whatever the vision was, it marked the end of his earthly work. Thomas spent his remaining months in quiet contemplation, withdrawing from the debates and writings that had once defined his life. It was as if he had crossed the threshold from reason to revelation, from philosophy to pure faith. Then, just a few months later, Thomas fell ill while traveling to the Second Council of Lyon. Weak and fading, he asked to be taken to a nearby monastery, where he spent his final days in prayer. When death finally came, He left this world not as a scholar defending an argument, but as a humble servant, surrendering to a truth greater than words. His silence in those last days speaks louder than all his writings. It reminds us that while reason is a powerful gift, there are moments when only faith can take us further. And for Thomas, the man who sought to unite faith and reason, that final step was not found in books or debates, but in an encounter with the divine itself. As Thomas Aquinas lay on his deathbed, the man who had once filled pages upon pages with profound theological insights had now fallen completely silent. The scholar who had spent his life reasoning about God had reached a point where words were no longer needed. He had seen something beyond philosophy, beyond argument, a truth so overwhelming that all human explanations seemed small in comparison. His final journey had begun when he fell ill while traveling to the Second Council of Lyon. His health declined rapidly, and his companions knew he would not recover. At his request, he was taken to the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, a quiet monastery far from the grandeur of universities and cathedrals. Here, in the stillness of its stone walls, the greatest thinker of his age prepared to meet his Maker. Even in his weakness, Thomas's humility never wavered. As death approached, he did something astonishing. He asked to receive the Eucharist as a beggar. Despite his towering intellect and achievements, he saw himself as nothing more than a humble servant of God. He refused any privilege, insisting that he was no different from the simplest of believers in need of grace. His last words reflected the depth of his faith. "I receive you, ransom of my soul. For love of you, I have studied and kept vigil, toiled, preached and taught. Never have I said anything against you, but if I have, it was through ignorance, and I do not persist in my opinion. If I have ever written anything erroneous, I submit all to the judgment of the Holy Roman Church, in whose obedience I now pass from this life." With those words, the mind that had shaped Christian thought for centuries surrendered itself completely to God. On March 7th, 1274, Thomas Aquinas breathed his last. There was no dramatic farewell, no final philosophical treatise, only a man who had given everything to the pursuit of truth, finally resting in the presence of the one he had spent his life seeking. His passing marked the end of an extraordinary earthly journey, but his voice was far from silenced. His writings would soon spread beyond the walls of monasteries and universities, influencing popes, councils, and entire generations of thinkers. The Summa Theologica, though unfinished, would become one of the most foundational works in Christian theology, and the legacy of Thomas Aquinas, the dumb ox who once sat in silence, would echo through history forever. But what made his influence endure was not just his intellect, it was his unwavering conviction that faith and reason were never meant to be enemies, but partners in the search for God. And though his life had ended, his work was only beginning. Centuries have passed since Thomas Aquinas took his final breath in that quiet monastery, yet his voice has never truly gone silent. His words, his teachings, and his pursuit of truth continue to shape the way we understand faith and reason today. In an age when belief and logic are often seen as opposites, his legacy stands as a beacon, proving that they are not enemies, but partners in the great journey toward God. His most famous work, the Summa Theologica, remains one of the most studied texts in theology and philosophy. Popes, scholars, and even secular thinkers still grapple with his arguments, marveling at their clarity and depth. His 5 ways, his logical proofs for the existence of God, are still discussed in classrooms and debates around the world. Even those who challenge his conclusions cannot ignore the brilliance of his reasoning. But Thomas's influence goes far beyond academia. His teachings were formally recognized as the foundation of Catholic doctrine, and in 1323, Pope John XXIII declared him a saint. Later, in 1567, he was named a Doctor of the Church, a title given only to the most profound theological minds in Christian history. His feast day is celebrated annually, and his works continue to guide millions in their spiritual journeys. Even outside of the church, Thomas's impact is undeniable. His belief that faith and reason are complementary has shaped Western thought in ways many do not even realize. Modern universities, founded on the principle of intellectual inquiry, owe much to his insistence that truth should be sought fearlessly. His work even laid the foundation for natural law theory, which influences everything from ethics to lawmaking today. Yet perhaps the most powerful part of his legacy is not found in books or titles, but in the simple truth he lived by, that the search for God is both an intellectual and a personal journey. He showed that thinking deeply about faith does not weaken it, it strengthens it. That asking questions does not lead us away from God, it draws us closer. And so, even though his earthly voice was silenced in 1274, his words still call to us today. To the scholar, he says, seek truth with both your heart and mind. To the doubter, he says, faith and reason are not enemies. Keep searching. And to the believer, he whispers, all knowledge, all wisdom, all truth ultimately lead to God. Thomas Aquinas may have left this world long ago, but his voice still echoes through the halls of history, through the minds of those who study, and through the hearts of those who still seek. And as long as people search for truth, his voice will never fade. Thomas Aquinas did not seek fame, power, or prestige. His only pursuit was truth, a truth so vast that it could not be contained by reason alone, yet so profound that it demanded intellectual exploration. He proved that faith is not the enemy of knowledge, but its highest fulfillment. Even today, his words challenge us to think more deeply, believe more fully, and seek God with both our hearts and our minds. His life reminds us that the greatest discoveries are not just those found in books, but those revealed through humility, prayer, and an open soul. At the height of his brilliance, Thomas saw something greater than all his writings, and in that moment, he understood some truths are meant to be lived, not just explained. So now the question is yours to answer. How do you seek truth? Do you embrace both faith and reason as Thomas did? If his story has inspired you, share this message with someone who needs it. And remember, the search for truth is never in vain, because all truth ultimately leads to God. A prayer for wisdom and faith. Father in heaven, you are the source of all wisdom, the light that guides our steps. Just as you led Thomas Aquinas to seek you with both his mind and his heart, help us to do the same. Strengthen our faith when we struggle with doubt, and deepen our understanding when we seek answers. Let our pursuit of truth always bring us closer to you, and may our knowledge be used for your glory, not our pride. Teach us to trust in you beyond what we can comprehend, and to walk in humility, knowing that true wisdom begins with reverence for your name. We surrender our thoughts, our studies, and our hearts to you, Lord. Lead us in your truth, and help us to love you with all our mind, soul, and strength. Amen.